Good afternoon. This is Chuck Morse, Left Right Radio. Welcome to the show, which I am doing Monday through Friday and around noontime, give or take. What if Trump were liberal? This thought occurred to me earlier today when I was reflecting on my program yesterday with author and I would describe him as ultra liberal activist Steve Almond, in that he came on the program and he just wrote a book about Trump saying what the hell happened, essentially. I think that's the title of Bad Stories, What the Hell Happened to America. And he went on the usual litany of codified talking points, I suppose you'd call them. I mean, these are like sacred articles for Trump's opponents in terms of what's bad about and what's wrong with Trump. And they were all to do, or they were mostly to do, or they certainly started as all about various insulting comments that Trump either made or that were essentially extracted from comments that he made, that would prove that he's got something against Black men and women, he's got something against Mexicans or whatnot. And, they were the usual litany of insulting comments, and Trump certainly has a penchant for making insulting comments. There's no question about that, which is something that I don't think anybody particularly likes about him. It's a fault. We're all flawed characters, let's face it, and that's his big flaw. But this was why, there's something wrong, and this is the main argument against him, things that he said, not necessarily things that he's done. I mean, maybe that describes the liberal zeitgeist anyways. Everything has to do with what you say, not what you do. So if you can say that you like something, or you could say that you support something, that's enough. You don't have to actually do anything. That's part of, I think, being on the left anyways. You get to be one of the beautiful people because you just simply make certain comments. You don't actually do anything in your life that would help anybody. That's something that just somehow magically happens. But anyway, with Trump, it's like he makes these comments and they go on this long list of them. And if I went through it, everybody would be familiar with them. And including the crown jewel, which was his conversation with that magazine where he made really derogatory comments about women, and which, by the way, was a private conversation that was recorded. This is sort of the centerpiece. And it occurred to me that if Trump were a liberal, if Trump were a Democrat, if Trump were a quote unquote progressive, as they define the term, then none of this would have mattered. None of this would have been dismissed. It would have been ignored. It would have been laughed at. It would have been excused. That if Trump were a liberal, this stuff would not have gotten the attention that it's gotten. If Trump were a liberal, these comments and people who looked at them and criticized them would have been denounced. These people would have been attacked. They would have been psychologized. We would have heard hours and hours endlessly about what's wrong with them mentally, right? Just like what they tried recently to do to Kanye West, by the way. Something wrong with their mental state. We would hear, in other words, don't listen to these people. And they would have trotted out someone into the media, very much like they did with Hillary Clinton when Bill was president, to announce that this was part of a vast right-wing conspiracy. That all these attacks on our beloved great leader, the glorious, guy that we're genuflecting to, that this is part of a right-wing conspiracy to get rid of, our power. Just like what they said about Clinton. And if Trump were a liberal, for example, I'll give you some other examples, putting aside the dismissal of all this stuff, which is entirely on their part a relativistic attack because they wouldn't care if he was liberal. Jews would have been dancing, my fellow Jews, and I happen to be Jewish, They would be dancing in the streets when the liberal President Trump did what every president since Clinton was called to do by Congress and recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem. They would have been taking the Torahs out of the case and bringing them out into the streets. And people would have been dancing the horror, and you would have seen tears in people's faces. It would have been like the 6-Day War. When this happened, by the way, I remember at my Reform synagogue, I'm old enough to remember this. You know, we were Reform Jews tend to be very liberal, and as such, they're not exactly prone to emotion, and they're not particularly filled with soul. You know, they were dancing. I mean, there was a movement, a feeling like, you know, Israel is strong. Israel has arrived. We're on the side of the winners. But no, because it was President Trump who did this, you didn't hear a pin drop. I was at a Seder where I couldn't even mention it because of the liberals. You know, at the end of the Seder service, there's a tradition to say, next year in Jerusalem. I wanted to say next year as a joke, next year at the American Embassy in Jerusalem. But I knew that it would be much too provocative, much too shocking. You know, you'd have to pass out the smelling salts. I would hear a tongue lashing from people if I dared to do this. But what if Trump were liberal? I don't think so. What if Trump were liberal and he went after the Iranian mullahs? Let's say that Obama had been a right-wing conservative who had handed over a treaty to the mullahs that allowed them to get access to $150 billion and continue building their nuclear facilities without any interruption, and use the money to fund their military and send it to terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and destabilize the entire Middle East. Oh, we would have never heard the end of that. And then if the liberal President Trump tore up that agreement and said, we're going to stand up for freedom in the world. We're going to reimpose sanctions on this evil regime. We're going to help the Iranian people get rid of this monstrous evil. Oh my goodness, liberals would have been cheering. They would have been calling for a Nobel Prize. What if it had been the liberal Trump who had stood up to Kim Jong-un and brought him to the bargaining table and set up a meeting to end the Korean War? You know, oh my goodness, we would never have heard the end of it. What if it had been the liberal Trump who had presided over an increase in employment among the African American community to the highest level since such employment had been created? We wouldn't have heard any talk about Trump as a racist. We wouldn't have heard any talk about Trump's quote unquote base as secretly having something against Black people. No. We would have heard about this progressive, leader who is creating more equality and more opportunity. And we would have heard speeches with soaring incantations, from Black pulpits, right? People that sound like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. We have seen the mountaintop. We are moving forward to take full possession of the American mandate. We're advancing. But no, we're not hearing any of those intonations because it's Trump, because Trump is not, quote, a liberal. I could go on of all the things that President Trump has accomplished under his watch. And by the way, if he were liberal, he'd be getting credit for 100% of it, not being said, oh, well, this is really his predecessor, blah, 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 I could go on in a long list. There's much more. This man has been an incredible president, probably the most successful in terms of moving the needle since FDR. But if he was a liberal, we'd get credit, but of course he's not. He's a conservative. He's one of my kind. And he's committing blasphemy as such. He is deconstructing the left-wing corrupt state that has been building up since the days of Woodrow Wilson. So he's hated and he's loathed. Steve Almond yesterday on my program was at his core a typical Trump-hating liberal. And I don't want to put them all in a basket here, so I want to be careful. But you could watch the video yourself. It's posted on my network. It was yesterday's show, in which he presents himself publicly. And his column or his blog in the New York Times certainly presents this as a new kind of a man, like a compassionate, soft-spoken. He wants to get rid of the old model, which he views as aggressive and violent. He wrote a book basically trying to get rid of football because it's too violent. On the surface, he makes a good argument, of course, as usually liberals do. He brings up a real issue, which is concussions. That's something that I do think that the National Football League and football, college football and high school football, they have to deal with that. If I had a son, I don't think I'd want him, frankly. I'd have serious questions about his playing football, even if he was a big guy like Aaron Hernandez, whose brain was turned into Swiss cheese because of the amount it was knocked around. It's a big problem for football. One that I think probably could be resolved with maybe a couple of modifications, both in terms of the equipment, maybe the helmet, what they wear, and also in terms of how the game is played. And I hope they do. But at the core, that really was just an entree for him. He really wanted to get rid of football because it's too male and too aggressive and too, it fosters the male spirit. So, which I think is wrong, because you need to have an outlet for both men and women. That's the whole spirit of the Olympics, to have a peaceful way to express aggression, right? That's, rather than go to war, you're able to channel your aggression through an organized game where people can be aggressive in a setting that is, nonviolent at its core. Not that violence doesn't happen, but, for the most part, it's a nonviolent expression of rage and of aggression, which is good. But no, he wants to get rid of it because he wants to have this new, softer man. And yet on my program, and you can watch this, it's really something, with a couple of mild comments on my part that supported President Trump and that criticized his thesis. And I'm going to get into that briefly. He had a complete meltdown. His head was spinning. You could see, he was like, going through a Tourette syndrome as a ticks flying everywhere. Classic left-wing memes that go all the way back, frankly, to Karl Marx. And if you take a look at, various movements, oftentimes people subconsciously embrace the mannerisms and memes of the founders. In the left, you can study Marx to see why they behave the way they do. This insufferable arrogance and this hostility and this holier-than-thou self-righteousness took over. And he began to, if you watch it, it's actually sad to see a relatively young man so distorted with hate and rage. And, and to the point where he was almost crying by the end of the show and screaming and insulting and calling me every kind of name you could imagine. And he was like distorting himself. He was shapeshifting into something, really bizarre, actually, if you look at it objectively. And that, he starts by saying, I'm right wing, as if that's an epithet. I'm like, yeah, that's right. I am right wing and you're left wing. Fine. But, the guy was absolutely, it's like he'd never been exposed to anybody that didn't goose step to his point of view. And he could not tolerate it. And he had a complete meltdown. It was completely violent. And this is from Mr. Peace and Love, which of course is my point here. Underneath the surface of all these people is rage and hate for anybody that doesn't genuflect to their point of view. And that this whole idea of banning aggression is preposterous. It runs against human nature. The question isn't banning aggression. The question is channeling aggression properly so that we can have aggression in a way that's positive and that accomplishes things. I just will finish by commenting a little bit on a couple of points he brought up, which I thought were particularly bizarre and which are not reflective of your average liberal because they're further to the left than liberals. In that he mentioned corporate, quote unquote, interests. And I responded because we were talking about President Trump. And I said, look, first of all, the big corporate money, the Wall Street money, the Wall Street interests went to Hillary Clinton, not Trump, and to Barack Obama in 2008, where he got more Wall Street money than any candidate in history. Oh, that's when he started to actually burn with rage. And his response was interesting. He goes, well, evil, the corporations are evil, and this is, they're exploitative. And I pointed out, I said, look, I happen to think that in general, corporations are great forces of good, which absolutely ticked him off. I'm not saying that every corporation is individually good. There are bad ones, of course. Look at Enron and others who are corrupt and they're evil and they've burned people. And I'm not an anarchist in that I think that corporations ought to be regulated and they enter into a contract with a state as a way to form, and then that contract includes, a certain amount of oversight and regulation. But that as a general structure, they are good. They're forces of good. So he said, well, what do I mean by that? He finally stopped for a minute and took a breath. How do I mean that? What's good about them? And I pointed out, well, they provide goods and services that we want, and they employ people by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, if you look at the country, and that they create things where they didn't exist. I mean, we could talk about Microsoft or Facebook, which is hosting this program, or any other corporation. That they're good. They're good, and I pointed out that the New York Times, who he works for, is a corporation. And then he responded to me by demanding, why do I think corporations exist? And I reiterated what I just said. And he said, no, they exist for one reason and one reason only. And that is to make a profit. So it got really bizarre. So I'm like, well, yeah, I hope they make a profit. I mean, I don't want to see them lose money. How are they going to stay in business? But no, they're not only in business to make a profit. Not that there's anything wrong with profit. It's great. I mean, does he think the New York Times is in business just to make a profit? Is he in business just to make a profit? After all, he's paid, I assume, by the New York Times. Is he just doing it for the money? No, I didn't go that far in it. I probably should have. I'm kind of taking the luxury of answering that question now in a little bit more detail. But this gets to a real demented view on the left, that they think that, first of all, they view the question relatively anyways, because if you scratch the surface, what they're really saying is that corporations are evil, excuse me, and that they are for profit if they don't agree, if they don't support leftism. If they're liberal and they support leftist causes, and then they're absolved, they're fine. In fact, they're good. But also at its core, it's communist. I mean, what is this? I mean, that we're not going to have private ownership, and I mentioned that. There's no private ownership of the means of production. Everything has to be controlled by the government. This is somebody who started the program by pounding his chest about participatory democracy. And yet, what could be less participatory than communism, where everything is owned by the state? There are no corporations. There are no businesses. There's no property. There's nothing private. Everything is owned by the government. And then mankind becomes just essentially a human resource, a part of a beehive. And I'll just finish with one reiteration of something I did bring up on the program, because I just think it needs to be said here. He started out with, when I mentioned that, his book Bad Stories essentially says in a nutshell, at least the part of the book that he talked about, that the bad story of America, because we're racist and we had slaves, led to a result, which was the election of Donald Trump. He links it to that. And my response was that we have to take a look at American history. He says, well, the Constitution was written by slave owners, and it did not, it did not enfranchise people. And I did respond to it, but I want to just elaborate a little bit more. I don't want to go too far over here. And that is that this is a very malevolent and hateful view of America. The reason they hate America is because we're free and capitalist, and we recognize that sovereignty comes from the creator and not the state. But more specifically, this is a malevolent view because, and as I pointed out, at the time of the founding of the American Republic, and we're not a participatory democracy, we are a limited government federal republic. The government has limited powers, divided powers, and it has indirect democracy in the form of electing representatives to that government by the House of Representatives. And that government has powers that are prescribed by a constitution. We're not a direct rule to, mob rule, majority rule country. We respect the right of the minority. He wants to get rid of the Electoral College, by the way, which I pointed out has everything to do with dividing powers so that every region of the country can elect the president, which he said was motivated by slavery. That's why they put it in there. That's a talking point that I've heard out there by the left. And by the way, I don't doubt that that might have been a little part of it, but that's not the main story. I don't think James Madison was he might have been a slave owner as far as I know, but I honestly don't think he was let's figure out how to save slavery. He had bigger concerns. And I think that it's true to say that the founding fathers, including the slave owners, viewed slavery as evil. They didn't have the strength to get rid of it at the time, which was a flaw, and I mentioned that. But they wanted to see it phased out. My proof in that is that in the Constitution itself, it ends the slave trade by 1808. And I think that if you look at the letters at the time and the writings at the time, that's generally true, that they didn't know how to get rid of it because they were dependent on it economically, but they knew that it was evil. And that a large portion of the founding fathers were anti-slavery, including the Adams family, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton and some of the others, particularly in the North. But my point to him was that even though the Constitution, you have to look at history in the context of its times, the Constitution recognized the sovereign rights and enfranchised white adult men who were property owners. That is true. And everyone else had either second-class citizenship or they were slaves. That is true. But the fact is that this was a revolutionary development in the history of civilization. Never before, with a couple of minor brief exceptions, had so many people assumed sovereign rights. Never before had you had such a large segment of a population recognize that their rights came from the creator, not the state. That they had the state was not, the typical type of government at that time in the world, including in the most enlightened parts of the world, like England, was based on the concept of a divine right of kings. There were no rights. England began the process with the Magna Carta, but nevertheless, even there were no rights recognized. The king had all the power. The king was the only person with any rights, and that everyone else was a subject. There were no recognized rights. There was no inalienable rights. The king would grant privileges, not rights, based on whim, based on what the king thought was best for him. And the king would mete out punishments based upon what he thought hurt him. And it was arbitrary. It was by fiat. It was sheer government power. There was no concept of rights emanating from the people at all. That only returned with communism, by the way, where all of a sudden the state was once again enthroned. Hegel developed the concept of the state as having almost an organic life, and that the state was enthroned to be an agent of change that would eventually transform man into a one-world beehive. That came later. That was a regression away from the American system. That the American system, by recognizing the rights of a large segment of its population, in that case, white men over a certain age who were landowners, that moved the ball forward in terms of recognizing the natural rights of the human citizen. Eventually, that would expand to include all men. And eventually, once with the Civil War, it ended slavery, and it included African Americans and everyone else, as imperfect as that was. And we never quite have fulfilled as the late, great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out, the true meaning of our creed, but we're working on it. We're not in a perfect society. I mean, Steve Allman is typical of the left. He's a perfectionist. But then eventually we recognize the right of women to vote, and it goes on. I mean, we continue to move the franchise forward. We lower the voting age, et cetera. And the result has been that we have enfranchised and recognized the natural rights of more and more people. It's part of the process of what America is, as imperfect as that is. And thus, I view this as a glass half full, not half empty. He views it as half empty because they were racists, and he links it to Trump. I mean, it's bizarre, but that's really, I think when you get down to it, the essence of what the left is all about. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching today, everyone. I'm going to end it on that note. I shall return, hopefully, the usual time tomorrow around noon. And have a good day, everybody.